Hello, this is Gerard Perry for Books, Music, and News Review, and today I just like to take a little time to explore an issue that's cropped up in the presidential race. Some of you may be familiar with the soundbite by Bernie Sanders, one of the leading candidates for president in the Democratic primaries. He was quoted to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, but basically he said, yes, Cuba was a dictatorship ruled by the Castros and continues to be a communist dictatorship, but they vastly improved the general literacy of the public, and they have great health care. And after being criticized for this, he doubled down, and during an interview on 60 Minutes, he said, of course I'm going to praise Castro for what he did regarding education and healthcare. And I just wanted to focus for the next 25 minutes or so on the fallacies inherent in this statement. And it's hard to know where to begin, but I'm going to use some of my time to look at the firsthand experience of Cubans who lived under the Castro regime. And I'm going to be using this as my main text, Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant by Umberto Fontova. And he has firsthand experience of this in his family, of the complete disaster that the Castro regime and that communism turned Cuba into. So I'm going to rely on that book, as well as a companion book exposing the real Che Guevara and the useful idiots who idolize him, which was written relatively shortly after this first book. And they both tackle the media and academic and cultural cachet that these horrendous individuals who enacted numerous atrocities enjoy, particularly in places that haven't been subject to the same rigors of communism that nations like Cuba and Vietnam and Laos and China have. And one of the interesting things about Bernie Sanders is that he describes himself as a democratic socialist. Meanwhile, he has staffers, and this was exposed by James O'Keefe and Project Veritas, who brag about gulags and interning their political enemies in gulags. And these people have yet to be disciplined or fired, as far as I know, and as far as this taping, I don't think any of these people have been disciplined. Their Twitter accounts have been protected, but as far as I know, they haven't been reprimanded or rebuked by Bernie Sanders. And it's not surprising when you think of someone who admires communism so much. He spent his honeymoon in the Soviet Union, and even as there were granted, this wasn't the Soviet Union of the 1930s and 40s under Joseph Stalin. So the vast network of gulags had been reduced, and most of the violence had subsided, but people were still being relentlessly persecuted and imprisoned. This occurred at the same time that the refusnik movement of Jews trying to be released from the Soviet Union was occurring. And Bernie Sanders was also a vociferous defender of Daniel Ortega when he was the dictator of Nicaragua for over a decade. And again, just like his praise of the Castros, this is something he refuses to renounce or even reconsider the idea that he might have been wrong. And it's not surprising when you consider the fact that he describes himself as a democratic socialist, presumably to differentiate himself from the socialists who plunged Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and China and Russia into decades and decades of horror and just the abolition of individualism and any sort of autonomy apart from the state. And I think people need to be reminded that socialism and communism were viewed as synonymous, not only by critics of these philosophies, but by the people who espouse them. And in fact, socialism, if you go back to Marxian theory, communism is simply one stage, an intermediate stage before the realization of full socialism, which will result in this wondrous utopia, according to Karl Marx. And of course, we've seen with the implementation of socialism and communism throughout the world how faulty this theory is. And you just need to look at the many victims of communism and socialism throughout the centuries. There was a great book called The Black Book of Communism, which documented on a country-by-country and case-by-case basis how many people had been exterminated because of this pestilential ideology. And it clocked in between 80 million and 100 million. But one of the interesting things about the Sanders soundbite, some people on social media tried to offer a counter example. What if he had praised, would he still praise Nazi Germany for their improvements in automotive technology or some other beneficial aspect of the Third Reich? But I think an even better counterexample to this would be Pinochet. Would Bernie Sanders praise Augusto Pinochet, who is widely reviled by the left and is viewed as one of the most evil human beings and rulers in the 20th century? When he took over Chile was an economic basket case. They had runaway inflation. They were on the verge of basically becoming a Soviet puppet, and they were caught in between a Cold War battle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, between the West and the East. And Salvador Allende, who's beatified by the left, was taking Chile further and further into the camp of the Soviet Union and their allies in the Warsaw Pact. Now, after Pinochet took over, and from that point on until he voluntarily stepped down in 1990 after he lost plebiscite, for that a little over a decade, Chile's economy skyrocketed. He improved employment. He brought a country that was on the verge of collapse and civil war into a place where it was relatively stable and was the envy of other Latin American countries. Now, would Bernie Sanders praise him for doing all of that, despite the fact that a little less than 3,000 people were killed or died during his regime? Now, some of them were communist revolutionaries, some of them were political dissidents, some of them were journalists, but the people like Bernie Sanders would nonetheless condemn him woolly. They don't find anything good about Pinochet, despite the fact that he rescued his country from the brink of economic collapse. But none of them would say, well, it was worth killing these 3,000 people in order to do that. Now, contrast that with Fidel Castro and his regime, who are responsible either directly or indirectly for the deaths of between 500,000 and 1.2 million people, depending upon how you calculate. The people who died trying to escape Cuba, the people who were killed during the Angolan Civil War, and Castro decided to send 25,000 troops to Angola in order to further his imperial ambitions to advance communism there. And that resulted in the deaths of at least 5,000 Cuban troops, and there were 4.2 million Angolans displaced. Now, the Cuban forces weren't solely responsible for that, but they had a direct impact. And in fact, their reinsertion later in the latter part of the 1980s actually precipitated an increase in the conflict. And some people said it led them to a peace settlement where the MPLA, the communist faction, was able to come out decisively and win. And even today, they're the ones that are in charge of Angola. So you have that in addition to the people that he's directly responsible for killing after crushing the rebellion in Camagüey during the Bay of Pigs revolution, and the people who were killed in La Cabana prison under the leadership of Che Guevara, who was basically the regime's killer. He was the Lavrente Beria of the Cuban Communist Party. And Mr. Fontova documents this in his book, Exposing the Real Che Guevara, in a chapter called Fidel's Favorite Executioner. So he says, during these bloody months, Time magazine featured Cuban revolutionary Comandante Ernesto Che Guevara on its cover and crowned him the brains of the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro was the heart and Raul Castro the fist. Now, Raul eventually inherited power from Fidel after he left and died within a few years. Wearing a smile of melancholy sweetness that many women find devastating, Time gushed. Che guides Cuba with icy calculation, vast competence, high intelligence, and a perceptive sense of humor. The tone of the Time article was in perfect league with other major media and utterly wrong. Guevara was no more the brains of the Cuban Revolution than Felix Dzerzhinsky had been the brains of the Bolshevik Revolution, or Himmler the brains of the National Socialist Revolution, or Beria the brains behind Stalinism. Che performed the same role for Fidel Castro that Dzerzhinsky performed for Lenin, Himmler for Hitler, and Beria for Stalin. He was the snarling enforcer, the regime's chief executioner. Under Che, La Cabana fortress had been converted into a Caribbean Lubyanka. His approach was thoroughly Chekist. Always interrogate your prisoners at night, Che commanded his goons. A man is easier to cow at night. His mental resistance is always lower. Exact numbers may never be known, but the orders of magnitude of these murders are not in doubt. Jose Villasousa, a Cuban prosecutor who quickly defected in horror and disgust, estimates that Che signed 400 death warrants during the first 3 months of his command in La Cabana. A Basque priest named Ioki de Aspiazu, often on hand to perform confessions and last rites, say Che personally ordered 700 executions by firing squad during that period. Cuban journalist Luis Ortega, who knew Che as early as 1956, writes in his book Yo Soy El Che that Guevara sent 1,892 men to the firing squad. In his book Che Guevara, a biography, Daniel Jones writes that Che himself admitted to ordering several thousand executions during the first year of the Castro regime. Felix Rodriguez, the Cuban-American CIA operative who helped track down Che in Bolivia and was the last person to question him, says that Che, during his final talk, admitted to a couple thousand executions. But he shrugged them off as all being of imperialist spies and CIA agents. Che's bloodbath in the first months of 1959 was not conducted for either vengeance or justice. Like Stalin's massacre of the Polish officer corps in the Katyn forest, like Stalin's Great Terror against his own officer corps a few years earlier, Che's firing squad marathons were a perfectly rational and cold-blooded exercise. And it's interesting that he mentioned Stalin's execution of the officers because a little earlier I mentioned the Cuban expedition to Angola. And it's interesting because the lead officer and the general in charge who was largely successful in that was Arnaldo Ochoa, who would be, later on, he would be brought up on fabricated drug trafficking charges and executed by the Castro regime because he posed a challenge to Fidel Castro. And a lot of people, and this is something explored in that book by Humberto Fontova, a lot of people think that Fidel intentionally sent Che on these wild goose chases to places like the Congo or Bolivia, where he was ultimately killed, in order to remove a threat to his power. And that was definitely the case with General Ochoa, who was eliminated because he presented a less corrupt, more competent figure posed against Fidel Castro, which was whose regime was severely threatened at the end of the 1980s after the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and eventually the collapse of the USSR. For a few years, Cuba was on the verge of was on the verge of what happened ultimately in North Korea, mass starvation, until they were able to capitalize on tourism from Europe and America. And that's another aspect that Fontova addresses, this idea of this idea of tourists being blinded to the depravity in Castro's Cuba. But he also writes about the contrast between pre-Castro Cuba and Castro Cuba in his book, in his other book, Fidel, Hollywood's Favorite Tyrant. And I'd just like to read a little bit of this to debunk all of these fallacies that people like Bernie Sanders believe, that Cuba was somehow better off after Fidel Castro seized power. So this is from the chapter "The Cowardly Leon" or Lion. The problem was, in the 1950s, the average farm wage in near-feudal Cuba was higher than in France or Belgium. The average Cuban farm was actually smaller than the average farm in the United States, 140 acres in Cuba and 195 acres in the United States. In 1958, Cuba, a nation of 6.2 million people, had 159,958 farms, 11,000 of them tobacco farms. Plus, only 34% of the Cuban population was rural. This is according to a U.S. Department of Commerce document titled Investment in Cuba, a public document available to all the Jason Blairs and Walter Durantes at the New York Times at the time, I might add. And here he's referring to people like Herbert Matthews, who acted as stenographers, basically, for the Castro's terrorist gang. And it should be noted that Castro only became powerful. He gained power initially before he even seized power through a series of gangs on Cuban campuses. And according to the Geneva-based International Labor Organization, in 1958, the average daily wage for an agricultural worker in Cuba was $3. If that sounds near feudal, consider that the average daily wage in France at the time was $2.73. In Belgium, it was $2.70. In Denmark, $2.74. In West Germany, $2.73. And in the United States, $4.06. And this is the country described as a third world, desperately illiterate backwater before Castro came. Let's not even get into the average wage in the rest of Latin America or Asia, much less Africa, though nowadays Cuba's standard of living can indeed be compared to Haiti's. And for people who know how desperately poor Haiti is, that is quite a statement. The general impression of the members of the mission, continues the U.S. Commerce Department study, from travels and observation all over Cuba, keep in mind this was before Castro took power, is that the living levels of farmers, agricultural laborers, and industrial workers are higher all along the line than for corresponding groups in other tropical countries. A UNESCO report from 1957 states, one feature of the Cuban social structure is a large middle class. Cuban workers are more unionized proportional to the population than U.S. workers. And keep in mind, this was during the 1950s, which was the apex of organized labor and union power in the United States. The average wage for an 8-hour day in Cuba in 1957 is higher than for workers in Belgium, Denmark, France, Germany. Cuban labor receives 66.6% of the gross national income. In the U.S., the figure is 68%. 44% of Cubans are covered by social legislation. That's a higher percentage than in the U.S. at the time. Liberals then and now, and this is Fontova speaking, like to think of pre-Castro Cuba as a veritable U.S. colony, a sordid playground of prostitution and casinos, horribly exploited by American corporations. JFK himself said this in an interview with French journalist Jean Daniel in 1963. I think that there is not a country in the world, including all the regions of Africa and any other country under colonial domination, where the economic colonization, the humiliation, the exploitation have been worse than those which ravaged Cuba, the result in part of the policy of my country. Calumny, cheap demagoguery. That's what an exasperated Spru Braden, former U.S. ambassador to Cuba, said after reading JFK's idiotic claims in that interview. That abysmal ignorance in Washington concerning this whole Cuban situation endures. In fact, only 5% of invested capital in Cuba in 1958 was American, and less than one-third of Cuba's sugar output was by U.S. companies. Cuba had a grand total of 9 gambling casinos in 1958. Gulfport, Biloxi, Mississippi, and this is on the Gulf Coast in the U.S., have double that number today. And chew on this one. In 1957, when it was touted as a playground for Americans, Cuba hosted a grand total of 272,265 U.S. tourists. That year, more Cubans vacationed in the United States than Americans vacationed in Cuba. We had a playground too. And this is something else that's not really emphasized, but at the time, Cuba had net immigration, not emigration. People think of Cuba now as a country where people flee for their lives on life rafts and hastily constructed inner tubes, and often die on the way to the U.S. This was what the complete opposite was the case in pre-Castro Cuba, where people actually immigrated to Cuba rather than emigrated from. And this is really good. In 1958, the Cuban people had the 3rd highest protein consumption in the Western Hemisphere. If you think that's interesting, take a look at this chart compiled by an intrepid Cuban exile living in Spain. Now, this is the food ration in 1842 for slaves in Cuba when slavery was still legal. Meat, chicken, and fish, 8 ounces. Now, this is the ration for the Castro government since 1962, 3 years after they took power. 2 ounces of meat, chicken, and fish. For slaves, 4 ounces of rice. For Cubans living in Castro's tropical gulag, 3 ounces of rice. For starches, 16 ounces for the slave ration. And for the Cubans in Castro's Cuba, 6.5 ounces. For beans, 4 ounces for slaves. And for Castro's people, 1 ounce. Turns out, and this is Fontova speaking, when we say Castro enslaved Cuba, we actually miss half the story. We actually downplay the issue. Turns out the half-starved slaves on the ship Amistad ate better than Elian Gonzalez does now. Remember that when you hear Eleanor Clift say to be a poor child in Cuba may be better than being a poor child in the U.S. Remember that when you hear socialism works, I think Cuba might prove that, which is what Chevy Chase said on Earth Day 2000 after a guided tour of Castro land. Cuba's stellar achievements in the field of health and nutrition saw Havana host the 2nd Inter-American Conference on Pharmacy and Nutrition in June 2003. 2 months earlier, Castro's police had rounded up more than 100 dissidents, put them through sham trials, and shoved them into dungeons. Their combined sentences total 1,454 years. So, this is just to point out how warped the ideology is that animates the Sanders campaign, and these people who are basically red diaper babies, and Sanders is that age where he would have been a red diaper baby. In other words, someone whose parents were fully supported Stalin. So despite the fact that he denies it now, he would have been the equivalent of the Stalinist or perhaps a Trotskyite, but nonetheless, he supported these regimes. Now, this is, I'm just going to wrap up by reading something that a progressive, i.e. a liberal economist, Brad DeLong, pointed out, and this is Pre-Castro Cuba. Cuba, and this is from the Hans Bader article I referenced earlier from Intellectual Takeout. Cuba in 1957 was a developed country. Cuba in 1957 had lower infant mortality than France, Belgium, West Germany, Israel, Japan, Austria, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Cuba in 1957 had doctors and nurses, as many doctors and nurses per capita as the Netherlands. And more than Britain or Finland, Cuba in 1957 had as many vehicles per capita as Uruguay, Italy, or Portugal. Cuba in 1957 had 45 TVs per 1,000 people, fifth highest in the world. Today, the UN puts Cuba's HDI, Human Development Indicators, in the range of Mexico. And Carmelo Mesa Lago thinks the UN's calculations are seriously flawed. That Cuba's right HDI peers today are places like China, Tunisia, and Iran, and South Africa. Thus, I don't understand lefties who talk about the achievements of the Cuban Revolution to have better healthcare, housing, education. So in other words, it simply lies. The idea that Cuba is better off today than it was under Batista is simply a myth. And I pointed this out online when someone said, oh, Batista was a dictator. I said Batista, my reply was that Batista had won democratic elections. And yes, later on he seized power undemocratically, but he won at least one presidential election more than Castro did, who has never held a democratic vote because he does not believe he just doesn't believe in the idea of anyone having a veto over what he can do or how he can exploit the Cuban people. So when you hear people like Bernie Sanders defend these things, you shouldn't be surprised because they are at their heart Stalinists. They're not fuzzy democratic socialists. They're Stalinists. And communism and socialism are interchangeable. That's why at the First or Second International, all of the socialist parties and all of the Marxist parties, which you find today, are socialist parties in Europe. So I think I just wanted to clarify some of the things from that statement, especially to people who might have misconceptions about what Cuba was like, and also to expose the hypocrisy of people like Bernie Sanders who wouldn't use the same metric, even assuming that they were correct, which, as I just explained, they're not. Cuba is a much worse place because of the Castros and because of communism. But even if they were correct, they still wouldn't give this benefit of the doubt to other people like Pinochet, who actually did increase the living standards and help accomplish certain things. But anyway, that's my take. I would definitely recommend reading either of these books. Look up Umberto Fontova online, read some of his articles. He has firsthand experience with this, and he's a brilliant writer and chronicler of communism's depravity. So that's it for Books, Music, and News Review. See you next time.